Hi everyone, in today's lesson we're going to graph trig functions with vertical shifts. So let's try example number 1. So let's say I want you to graph f of x equals negative 4 cos x minus 6. So the idea here is similar as what we did yesterday. We need ACPI. So what's the amplitude? What are the cycles? What's the period? And what's the interval? Now, with vertical shifts, it might be important for us to know the max and min values as well. You'll find that this will be helpful to set up your graph. So let's find the A. A is the absolute value of the number in front, so the absolute value of negative 4 is 4. The cycles are the number in front of the x. Here the number is just 1. Period is 2 pi over b, where b is the number of cycles. So 2 pi over 1 is simply 2 pi. Interval is period over 4, and that's what we're going to count by. So here we have period is 2 pi divided by 4, and 2/4 reduces to pi over 2. Now remember the definition of max and min. The maximum is found by taking the midline and adding adding the amplitude or the absolute value, right? The amplitude. So here the midline is the vertical shift. Remember, the vertical shift is -6. So my midline is -6 plus my amplitude, which is 4. So then my maximum value will be -2. Remember, the minimum is found by taking the midline and subtracting the amplitude or the absolute value of the amplitude. So since the midline is -6 and the amplitude is 4, -6 minus 4 is -10. So this tells me that my y-axis, my highest value will be -2 and my lowest value will be -10. So it's important that we have that because when I draw my xy axis to draw this graph, the idea is that you want to make sure that you're completely under the x-axis because we need to go from -2 to 10, -2 to -10. So I'm going to go ahead and label my axis here as -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6, -7, -8, -9, and -10. And I know that my midline is always this spot right here. My midline is my vertical shift. So if my -6 is my midline, I'm going to actually go ahead and draw in a dotted line at -6 because that's going to be my midline. And I'm still going to set up my x-axis through my interval. So my interval is pi over 2. So that's what we're counting by. So if we're setting this up, we're going to count. Oh, I need to tell you what to graph by. So let's continue to do 0 to 2 pi. So I'm going to count here as 1/2 pi. The next would be 2/2 pi, 3/2 pi, 4/2 pi. Now, 4/2 pi, 4 divided by 2 is actually 2 pi. So we know we can stop there. So 1/2, 2/2, 3/2, 4/2 will get us up to 2 pi. So I know I need to graph a -4 cosine graph. So the cos, if you remember from our 4 pictures, a cosine graph or a negative cosine graph will start at the minimum, go to the midline, go to the max, midline, and minimum, right? This is my negative cosine graph where the line in the middle is my midline. So here is my midline. So I'm going to start at the minimum, which is -10. So when I graph this, I'm simply starting at the midline as my minimum. That's my first point. Then I go to my midline. So my midline is here, making sure we're lining it up with our first tick mark. Then we're going to go to our maximum value. So my maximum value we said was -2. So my next tick mark over is at -2. Then I go to my midline, which is at 3/2 pi. And then I go all the way down to my minimum. So here is my negative 4 cosine x minus 6. So here is my trig function that's been shifted down 6 units. All right, let's try another example. Okay, example number 2. Let's graph f of x equals 3 sine pi over 4 x plus 2. So again, we need our A, our C, our P, our I. We're probably going to need our max and our min. So A is the absolute value of the number in front. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. The cycles or frequency is the number in front of the x. So that's going to be pi over 4. My period is defined as 2 pi over b, where b is the number of cycles. So 2 pi divided by pi over 4. And remember that if we are dividing fractions, we're changing, we're flipping. So we're going to keep the 2 pi, change the division to multiplication, and flip the pi over 4 to 4 over pi. And we can multiply straight across, and we get 8 pi over pi. And the 8 pi's will cancel to just get 8. Our interval is defined as period over 4. The period here is 8, and we divide that by 4, and we get 2. And if we want to find our max value, remember we take the midline and add the amplitude. And if we want the minimum, we're going to take the midline and subtract the amplitude. So midline here is the value of our vertical shift up here, which is 2. So that's my midline. So here my midline will be 2 plus my amplitude is 3. So my max is 5. My midline is 2 again, and I'll minus the 3. So then my minimum value will be negative 1. So these max and min values will tell us how to set up our y-axis scale. So I'm going to draw my xy axis. I know that I need to go up to 5 and down to negative 1, so I could probably adjust it like such so that I have all the values that I need. I'm just going to space it out a little bit, so I'll do every 2. So let's see if that'll work up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's a little high, but that's okay. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That will be my graph. Now we want to set up our interval on our x-axis, and we're going to count by 2s. Now I want to graph one cycle. I need to specifically tell you what to graph. So right now I'm telling you graph one cycle. And we know that one cycle is our period. So period will be 8. So we need to count up to 8. So I'm going to go over by 2s. So 2, 4, 6, and 8. All right, our midline is 2 at positive 2. That's my vertical shift. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in my midline as a dotted line. And I'm going to graph one cycle of sine. So we need to know the picture of sine. We know that sine will start at the midline. It will go up, down, up, right? That is my sine graph where this is my midline. So if this 2 is my midline, we have to go to the max, then the midline, then the min, and then the midline. So here is my first dot. We're always graphing a sine graph this way. So we're going to go up to the max value of 5 is my next dot, right? So here's my first. My second is at my max. So my max is at 5. Then I go down to the midline. Then I go down to the minimum value, which would be down here. And then I'm going to go back up to my midline for my final one cycle. So I go up and down and up, and that is my graph of 3 sine pi over 4x plus 2. Notice my midline is at 2, my highest value is at 5, my lowest value is at negative 1. period is 8. It took 8 to go one full cycle, which it did. And interval is 2, which we counted by. So everything looks great here. Here is my graph. All right. If you have any questions, now's the time to jot them down. Otherwise, we'll see you in class tomorrow. Have a good night.